couple of moments to welcome you all to Gardening in the Theater. As many, if not all of you know, we meet on the second Saturday of each month at 11 o'clock. And these programs are offered for free by donation from the Arts Center. So we're very, very happy to have you here with us today. If you feel so inclined, there is a donation box on your way out that we would be most grateful for any offerings that you have. Also wanted to introduce our guest speaker today, Micah Ross, and his partner Katie, who are the owners of Soil Not Dirt Farm in Crawford, Colorado. And so just want to give them a really warm welcome, because I know it's a busy time of year for them being here in spring season. So I'll go ahead and turn it over to them. But thank you again for being here.
Thank you. So I'm not much of a public speaker, and I might go this way and that way in a lot of different directions. But and if you guys, I mean, the big thing is if you guys have any questions, I'm happy to try to answer them. I've been composting for about 10 years, mostly commercial, and this is a little bit of a. I haven't really done backyard composting. I went out and bought a big compost turner that you pull behind a tractor. So a lot of my experience comes from mass amount of materials, a whole bunch of materials, and trying to compost that. And I probably, have a few tips and stuff for maybe how to do a little bit different in your backyard or what to do potentially. But a lot of the way I look at stuff is how you deal with a lot of material and how to do that. So this this year we probably produced about 1,000 yards of compost. I actually did a lot more than that. I worked with a couple farms and I helped them compost, and they allowed me to use some of their equipment and land and stuff like that. So, I mean, I probably produced 3,000 or 4,000 yards of compost, finished compost this year or last year. And we do it in a long windrow style. That's they're probably about 300, 400 feet long. And we use a turner, and that turner allows us to, add oxygen when the CO2 level is getting too high. And it also allows us to homogenize the ingredients really well, and also get them compost really moist. Because that's a big key. Moisture is a big key in composting, especially in our very dry climate. And I might look at those. That's essentially what I'm doing in the compost we offer and stuff. And then from there, composting can be approached in a couple of different ways. A lot of compost facilities deal in excess waste of something, which is great, and that's what it's the greatest thing we can do with excess materials or waste and stuff is to compost it down. What we do a little bit different is that we actually kind of look for certain ingredients so that we're kind of making more of a balanced and biodiverse compost, rather than just cow manure and wood chips, or which there's benefits and there's costs to what we do versus a more simpler compost that other people potentially make. So from there, compost obviously can do a lot of good things for the garden. If for whatever reason, if you don't have a high bacteria, a high fungal in your soil, essentially life in your soil, they can introduce that. Really well-made compost can have bacterial and fungal communities. It also can be super nutrient dense and be essentially food for your soil and for your microbes that are already there. So if you already have really good established soil, it can be food for your existing biology that's there. And it also helps soil structure, which is extremely important, especially if we're turning our soil a lot and disturbing it. A lot of I think what they get into, like versus no-till and tilling, which we, Colorado and the West has to till a lot more than say like the East, because we don't have the same kind of climate. So I think people find it a little bit more challenge not to till. But when you till and you disturb the earth, it loses structure and it kind of collapses onto itself. So compost can help that, rebuild that with the biology and stuff. And with that, with structure, it helps with water retention. Compost obviously holds on to water really well and stuff. So, any questions so far? Yeah.
So you talk about the microbes and all the living things in the soil. So how do you know if it's lacking?
You can send out a soil test.
Okay.
There's a few in the country now, but like earthfort.com, they're a soil biology testing lab up in Oregon. There's probably a few more out there nowadays. But yeah, they'll count. They don't count every single one because there's millions of them. But they'll do a sample test and they'll see if you have nematodes, protozoas, bacterial, fungal hyphae, and all this stuff, and they can kind of see where you're at.
Sounds like a blood test.
Yes, definitely. Yeah, I mean, I don't know if you heard of Elaine Ingram. She's a soil biologist and has been a really big person yelling out, saying, "Hey, there's living soil out there," and she actually helped start that lab. I know, I should probably turn up my too. She helped start that lab. She's not there anymore, but she was a big first, really, from some standpoints, we didn't think soil was that living and or how much that biology actually helped plants grow and stuff. And that's how I really got into the whole soil biology thing with compost tea. And essentially, so there people can call, teas and compost teas and manure teas and all these different things. When I say compost tea, I'm really saying you're taking something that has a lot of good biology and you're proliferating it into something that you can put out. Like if you can't afford a whole bunch of compost to put down, you can also make a tea of that compost and then spread it out and potentially be a cheaper, more cost-effective way. And there's a whole science to that too. Yeah.
I was just reading something this morning, and they were talking about molasses. To put molasses on your soil to.
Yeah. Yeah. So molasses gets into. Essentially, it's a sugar and some bacteria like sugar. So it helps them proliferate.
Okay.
So that's the idea. Now, have I heard that you can, like, say you can compost tea, and if you're really being, really going at it, like, things in, how it goes. Things in small doses can be good. Things in a lot of doses can cause problems. And I've heard that, like, say if you're doing a lot of compost tea with molasses as the food for the biology, and you can overdo it, it could create a certain kind of fungus in your soil. But so you don't want to overdo it, and always start with like a little amount. But yeah, I've heard of, essentially you can feed the microbes with molasses, and it also is high in calcium, which can be a good or bad thing. We have a lot of calcium, I think, in most of our soils around here. But so yeah, and I did a talk a few days ago, and I didn't really get into compost tea, but we could definitely talk about that. That's why I always enjoyed doing compost tea. And there's a few things with that, but maybe we'll see what we got on the board. So I've already been all here. So I don't really, people have been composting forever, and I don't really get into, you gotta do it this way, you gotta do it that way. It can be really a balance of what you have, how much energy you can put into it. If you wanna do passive compost, essentially do something and not do a lot of energy, you're probably gonna do something good, and make something good for your soils. Or you can be really intensive and do something really good for your soils. The biggest things are anaerobic, and that's things that create anaerobic compost would be too much water. Essentially, too much water and or too dense. Too dense would be like, say, using a lot of cow manure and sawdust. It's not going to breathe. And I'll talk about a little bit on creating the structure for your compost and stuff. But you want to that would create an anaerobic situation. Yeah.
How can you tell if something's anaerobic?
My anaerobic smell, what I describe it as is the sewer smell, because you're gonna get a couple smells in there that you're like, I don't know if I like that, but does it smell like the sewer? Which is a very defined anaerobic situation or sewer is, and that's what the smell. Or if you ever have water bogs that are super, water that an area that sits there, and you dig into it and the soil's almost black or something, that would be an anaerobic smell to me. Because the other classic smell you're going to get is ammonia and essentially nitrogen, excess nitrogen releasing out of your piles. Potentially, if it's really going and really hot and there's not enough carbon, you're going to smell ammonia. And that's a typical smell you're going to potentially smell. It's not like a bad smell, I would say. Potentially, you need to add more carbon in that situation. So anaerobic, too wet. And then from there we have too dry, which isn't the worst thing in the world, but I would say most compost is leaning on too dry side. Too dry, essentially you're just decomposing things slowly. You're not really composting. And also, it might be moisture is really important in compost. A lot of the information says, 40 or 50% moisture content. And I think you can take it up even higher, yeah.
Shouldn't the worms be active? I mean, if you see active worms and all those little centipedes
In compost? When the temperatures are dropping, but at 130 degrees, 140 degrees, not all those guys are going to want to hang out. Like, worms really love 70 degrees.
Maybe that's why I have so many worms.
It might be too slow. But and that's where I get into compost. Like, you can be doing a slow, I don't do that, I haven't done that, but I know a lot of people, you can have potentially a compost bin that's slowly passive. Like, essentially, if it's moist enough, but it's not really pulling heat, what is it doing? I think it's breaking down, composting down.
Okay.
Could you run into a few issues there potentially, but is it, or not? It could be great stuff for the soil, yeah.
Okay.
But if you have worms in there, that's always a good sign.
They are happy.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, if worms are in it, worms are very picky.
The roly-polies and all of those little centipedes.
Crawling in and out, yeah. And I don't do that much, and I'm not sure how it affects the garden and everything.
Okay.
But I don't think it's a negative thing, because you can also look at that as like something, it's organic matter for the garden. There's definitely biology going on in there. So yeah.
Great, thank you.
Yeah. Yes.
So with slow decomposition versus composting, if you're doing slow decomposition, is it basically using up the nutrients?
In the process?
Yeah, so like if you let the pile sit around for a year,
a test is going to, see, and that's where like, who really knows until you test it?
Uh-huh.
You know, like I have to, like even, you get into like carbon to nitrogen ratios of things, and so it kind of gets into what's really there, right? And are you continuously adding things at this moment, like in the same pile? So in my mind, you gotta stop adding new things and let that do its own thing and then have new. And if you keep on adding things, you're gonna have really, say, just to pull out an example, if you put wood chips in something and they're dry wood chips, sometimes they say that wood chips are a lot of carbon and they're nitrogen robbing, or they lock onto nitrogen. So if you take raw wood chips and throw them in your garden, where they can pull the nitrogen out, because that's what they soak up. And so, you know, it's really hard for me to say, you know, and what you can do if you're composting and you just decide to leave that pile alone, and then you have this whole bunch of this fine material on the bottom, you can send out for just a nutrient analysis and a biology test and see what it really is. But I would think that's what most people have been doing. It hasn't been working. You know, does it work? Or what could you do potentially to make it a little bit better? You know, and I would, getting back into the moisture thing, you know, two things with moisture. You want a good amount of moisture in there, but it also leads to that you need to maybe turn it more often. And so it's more work. But I would say I compost a lot. I think, hey, this is 60% moisture content, and I send it off the lap every time it's 40%. And I'm like, this is moist stuff. So that's the biggest thing, yeah. I mean, moisture content can really allow that to go, and then from there, when you add moisture, you might need to flop it every once in a while more so it can breathe, you know, depending on how structural you have it. So and then this one is the whole reason why so a lot of these number marks they have for compost, say the USDA and stuff, are really based on to make sure you're killing weed seeds and pathogens and stuff. So if that's your big concern, you need to get to 130 degrees for a certain amount of weeks. And so like if you're concerned about plant disease or something and you have this material, that's why they say compost, you know, they have compost should be up to 130 degrees to 160 degrees. Well, might say 170, I say 160, 165 for a couple week period. And you also got to remember that outside part isn't the same temperature as your inside temperature, so that's why you got to turn homogenize and stuff. That's if you're concerned about pathogens and weed seeds. I mean, so maybe you're not, and that's totally fine. I've been around manure for 10 years and had tons on me, and I've never had an issue. I've never had, you know, E. coli or salmonella or you know, all these things that we are concerned about in manure. But that's one reason they suggest those temperatures. And so, you know, we have, you know, a couple of things I would suggest, like when you're building piles and stuff, is it depends on, do you have equipment to maybe turn it, or if you're just doing the pitchfork, and really we get into, you know, what do you really want to manage? Because you don't want to make a big pile that you can't make sure how wet it is, how moist it is, and you're not able to, say it all collapses on itself and starts getting stinky, how am I going to turn it, you know? So manageable is important. One thing you could do is put it on, you know, you could have some pallets and have it on pallets so at least air is getting through the bottom, and you can also put moisture on it without worrying about getting it too wet. And that excess water can go down. Like I said, we do the windrow, style, which is, I mean, you can do this even in your backyard, but we do a windrow with a turner. And then the other thing you could do potentially is if you want to do, you're not really able, you want to make a big pile, but you're not able to turn it. The reason why they suggest a windrow, and if you build the pile right, you know, supposedly air gets pulled in through the bottom and chimneys out the top. And that's kind of why they do a windrow style. Another way is to do some kind of forced aeration, you know, doing pipes, doing pipes in the very bottom. If you do a big pile, maybe pipes in the bottom and then a pipe through the middle. And you could hook blowers onto it, or you could just have pipes running through it from end to end, and that potentially will help exchange some of that air and some of the CO2 that might be building up in it. The great world of carbon nitrogen ratios. So, yes.
I'm sorry, can I ask you, what is windrow?
A windrow?
Yeah.
It's a peaked, it's a kind of it's a triangle shape that's in a long, could be 200 to 300 feet long. It's kind of a long, I know, I wish I had photos.
Okay.
But yeah, I know, I'm like, how else they would use that term in some other way. But yeah, it's like a peaked pile, you know, so essentially, our big turner is probably, the row is from here to the wall, but then it peaks at 8 feet, like right here. And then it goes 200 or 300 feet down, and that's a windrow. My baby turner was probably from here to here, and only 4 feet tall. But once again, 3 or 4 feet, 300 feet long. So that's a windrow, a compost windrow.
How big of a pipe for like a home compost pile?
Not, and this is only a suggestion, because, you know, it's just, we're trying something, right? So we're obviously want a percolated pipe, right? You have holes in it and stuff. That'd be important. But you know, the irrigation pipes would be great. I mean, for 8-inch, you know, 8-inch. I mean, if you're talking about a pile yay big, and having a couple of those pipes running through it, honestly, it gets into, and same as compost too. Compost loves oxygen. And also on the flip side of that is the oxygen's being used really fast. When your compost is hot and all the microbes are doing their thing, oxygen is being used really fast. So anything will help.
Okay, and if you put it on a pallet, how do you keep it from falling through the sky?
Falling through? You could layer it with hay first. Yeah.
Do you want to stay away, I was taught stay away from dairy and like eggs, dairy products, in your compost, correct?
So, and this, and once again, from my standpoint, I wouldn't have a problem composting a whole bunch, but in a small backyard, I would follow whatever you like. If you go on the internet and say what to avoid in backyard compost, and they have the meat, grease, and dairy and eggs, I would just follow that. Now as me, would I have a problem doing a whole bunch of composting, a whole bunch of eggs if I had the right amount of carb and all this stuff, or dairy? No, I wouldn't be worried about it at all. I wouldn't do grease. I don't think grease would solve or help anything.
But eggshells would be okay.
They're calcium. I'm not sure why there would be a problem with that. The reason why they don't suggest meat is because it attracts animals. Well, we can compost dead animals, no problem. I mean, it's not we're mostly us even, or mostly water and nitrogen. So we'll compost down really fast, honestly, besides our bones. And that goes for animals too. The reason why they suggest that is you don't want raccoons digging in your pile because you left some chicken bones in there or something. So that's where I would, they have some of those avoidance in the backyard for certain reasons like that. And I'm not sure about all of them. So carbon to nitrogen ratios, I would assume most everything has a carbon to nitrogen ratio. I didn't go to, I can explain it to myself sometimes, and so it's, I mean, maybe there's somebody who's a little bit smarter, maybe or went to school a little bit longer, but like, so cow manure, so chicken manure is 10-to-1, right? So there's 10 parts of carbon to 1 part nitrogen, and that's what that's saying. And then from there, cow manure might be 25-to-1. Horse manure might be 30-to-1. Hay is 30-to-1. Alfalfa is 25-to-1. These are nitrogen sources. These are when they talk about having your carbon sources and your nitrogen sources. Those are essentially what's going to make your compost hot. The high nitrogen, the higher carbon to nitrogen ratio. I think it's not higher, it'd be the lower carbon to nitrogen ratio. Like 10-to-1, 25-to-1, anything that's below 40-to-1 would probably be found as a high nitrogen source for your compost. And there is plenty of things that are not manure that are high in nitrogen. Onions are really high in nitrogen. They're mostly water too, like us. So beans are extremely high in nitrogen. You could treat beans like chicken manure. I don't know if that's for all beans, but the beans they grow out there in the lake, the delta, I've composted with, and you cannot use very much at all because they're super high in nitrogen, and you gotta treat them like chicken manure, I would say. So then you get into your carbon ingredients, which carbon, so straw is 70-to-1. And these are generalizations. The only way I would know what these are if I send them out to a lab and they do a carbon to nitrogen. They do it in a different way, but with that number they pull out the carbon to nitrogen ratio. When did you write that? Is there another one?
No.
So straw. I have
Leaves, would leaves be?
Yes, leaves.
Dead leaves.
So green leaves are nitrogen. Brown leaves, what in the process happens with sun and air that turns something from, because that doesn't actually happen with chicken manure. Like chicken manure is going to always be 14-to-1. There's piles that I know have been out somewhere for 15 years. They're still high in nitrogen. But when you take plant matter, it does change. Like, so oat straw out in the field when it's green, it's going to have a higher, once again I'm going to confuse myself, it's carbon and nitrogen. It's going to have a higher, maybe it's 40-to-1. But when you let oats go brown out in the field, they're at the end, and the longer they're out there, they might be 70-to-1. So a few more carbon. Corn stalks, which we have a lot around here, 40-to-1. Sawdust, when you get into your really dry, older sawdust, it could be 100-to-1 to 300-to-1. Once again, that depends on if it's a softwood, hardwood, and how old it is too. Because actually, really older stuff, like say decomposed wood chips, will have less carbon to nitrogen ratio than newer, older stuff. But once again, it's all testing that. If you really want to know, maybe we're diving into something too much. But yeah, I actually have some straws might be, like I said, 70-to-1, and then other straws might be 120-to-1. So that's where, so when we get into carbon to nitrogen ratio, they are, that's where, so a lot of recommendation is whenever you're mixing your ingredients and doing your math, you want to be at 35-to-1 to make great compost. And that idea is, so I'm going to make it a little bit bigger. So 30-to-1 would be really hot compost. but you don't want to go any farther on the left of that. 35:1 would be great, and up to 40:1 might be compost that goes hot and then maybe starts cooling off faster, 40:1. So once again, we're taking these ingredients that have different carbon to nitrogen ratio, and don't ask me the math, but you take all those, you take those and you try to land between 30:1 and 40:1. So just the same as like, okay, I got a pile of chicken manure at 10:1, and then I got a whole bunch of sawdust at 100:1. How do you get there? There's a little bit of math in there. I have a computer program. I also am at this point I'm a little bit of a baker at this point, and I just know what to do. And not to say it turns out perfect, but I can get there. So once again, if you're using too much nitrogen, what will happen in that situation? Like if you're at 20:1 with whatever you're doing, it's going to be hot, and it's going to be hot for a long time, and potentially get too hot. And so when they say 130, 160 degree temperatures, you can be at 180. That compost can be 190. And at what point does it catch on fire? You ever heard of compost catching on fire? So, and that's a bad thing. It'll be anaerobic, materials actually getting burned, and you just, lots of nitrogen is being volatilized and just going into the atmosphere. So there's no reason to make 20:1 compost. If you're on the other spectrum, say you get all your ingredients together and it's technically 70:1, it might not get very hot. Or it might get hot and then next week it might not, and then it'll just go, the temperatures will drop in it. And so that means that you didn't put enough nitrogen in it. So that's why we have these numbers 30:1 to 40:1, is try to get you into a place that the compost is going to compost in these certain temperatures for a few weeks, and then maybe potentially gradually go down as time goes on.
I snuck in late, I hope I'm not asking a repetitive question. About how often do you want to turn your compost?
However much your back wants to,
It's not as bad as I worried about.
or your arm. I'll start with what we do. In the first 2 weeks when our compost is hot, we turn it every day. And then every other day for a week or two, and then every 3 days for a week or two. And we end up turning our piles 35 times in a 2 to 3 month period. Do you need to do that? No. And the reason we do that is because we're kind of speeding the process on. And also the reason why we're doing that is because we're able to add oxygen, add the water, and keep this going really quick. Your compost might take 6 months. So when do you want to turn it? Smell. Smell, if you're like if you, and this is potentially gets into a trial and error a little bit, but a few things for why you would want to turn it is to make sure it's moist enough. And I'll talk a little bit more about when you're building a pile, you really want to make it sure, before you start, make sure all the ingredients are super moist, and then from there you need to maintain. And a couple suggestions, you can overwater too when the compost is already going, so you got to watch out how you soak the pile. I feel like sometimes I'm maybe going too far down different alleys, but to stay on topic. But to see how moist it is, it would be a good reason to turn it and be like, you flip it over and you're like, wow. One idea I'm going to go back to keeping it moist content is, what I would do to maybe make it easier is when you build your pile, make sure it's all moist. This is my daughter. So when you build your pile, try to make sure wherever you feel best that it's at 50 or 60%. And then from there, and this is a trial and error after time, is when it's hotter, maybe you have a sprinkler on it for 5 minutes every day, 10 minutes. That pile is drying out. If it's hot and we have our typical climate of 0 humidity, it's drying out. So do you need daily moisture onto that? Potentially, yes. So get your piles all moist and then maybe have a sprinkler on it for 5 minutes a day. And you have that schedule, and when the compost pile is hot, you might cut that back if it's cooling off, because then it's not using as much moisture. But if you do something like that, and then you go to turn it, then you're like, oh, this isn't wet enough. Let me do 10 minutes a day. And that would be a good reason to turn it sometimes, just to see where it's at. The other reason to turn it is to homogenize it. You make a big pile, all your ingredients out here are super dry, super moist, so hey, I need to turn it every 2 days just to get it homogenized in the first 2 weeks. The other reason is over some days, your pile is going to sink and kind of sink onto itself and get smaller, and another good reason to turn it would be to fluff it. So
Aerating it then, is that what you're?
yes, yeah, yeah, and then why am I doing something, and what can I maybe not do because it's really not needed, is the way I'm looking at things all the time. And like I said, if you build a pile, if you're doing a backyard pile, you're really going to try to structure this in a way that breathes on itself, so you're not actually having to turn it a whole bunch because you're doing it by hand or something. In our compost pile, the oxygen, like I said before, like the oxygen is being used up really fast, and that's why we do turn it. But in your backyard, it's not the same situation potentially, especially if you build it in a certain way, and you're taking 5 or 6 months to compost your material down, not 3 months like we are. So once again, I get like air is important, but if it still has structure, I wouldn't be worried about turning it just because of air. You know, like I actually have like a CO2 tester. You stick it into the pile, and it tests the CO2, and that essentially tells you how much oxygen is in there. And sometimes we can turn our piles, and the oxygen's gone in like 5 hours. And so do we need to be turning it every day? We're wasting probably diesel, and so we choose not. We're not going to chase after the CO2 thing because it's just, is it really needed? And back to turn as often as you can, honestly. Based on, oh, my pile sank, my pile went from here to down here, let me flip it and turn it some. Ooh, I want to check to see where the moisture content is. And those are the main reason I would suggest on turning them. Yeah. And once again, that windrow, this has been a thing for a long time, is if you build it essentially a wide base up to a peak, and it's structured, it should be breathing somewhat on its own. It pulls oxygen through the bottom and chimneys out the top. And usually you'll find your hottest temperatures at the top. And that's why you might build it in a windrow form if you're able to. Did that answer? Yeah, cool. So did it kind of understand where we're at with the carbon and nitrogen game? Cool. So building the pile, structure is super important once again for breathing, and so you want to pick out ingredients that are, I like biodiversity. I like a lot of different ingredients. If you only have 2 ingredients, great. But you don't want to pile 70% manure with 20-30% hay. It won't breathe enough. And that's where you would probably need to turn it every 6 hours or something so it has enough oxygen. So you want to really, I'm going to throw out a recipe. Once again, we're getting away from the backyard composting because some people think, what do I do with my food scraps? I'm not really sure. I think you should feed them to worms. But, so if you're starting with a pile and you have 50% hay, that's gonna be good breathable material, hay, straw. And then, so you wanna get up to about 50% of one of those, maybe only 40%. And then you're gonna wanna do one of your manures. Once again, hay could compost on its own. Grass hay, like I said, is like 35:1. It could technically compost on one, but from there, I would suggest you want something dense, like a manure, or apple waste, which would be high in nitrogen. Onions, sawdust is dense. So you're trying to, they have kind of like a 1 through 4 structural density to make a pile. Like, okay, your hay's on 1, your cow manure's on 4, meaning one's really breathable, the other one won't breathe at all on its own. So you want to get those ratios. Once again, I'll just say a recipe. Say 50% hay. I wrote down a few. And you'll kind of get, if you look at these materials, you'll kind of get what I'm saying on, you want a certain percentage of this with a certain percentage of this to have good structure. 50% hay, 30% cow or horse manure, and 20% sawdust. So that hay is going to allow it to breathe, then the cow, horse manure might be a little, the horse manure is going to be a little less dense than cow manure, but there's something in there that's going to hold that water in there, and with the hay it's going to allow it to breathe. And then there's the sawdust too that isn't, it won't breathe either. It breathes more in cow manure, but it doesn't, it's not breathing as much as hay. Another recipe could be like 50% straw. So we have, once again, straw is going to be higher in carbon, so we're going to have a little bit more manure or more nitrogen at 40% cow or horse manure, and then less sawdust, 10% sawdust, because that's another thing that's really high in carbon. So if you're up at, if you're switching from hay to straw, you need to up manure and maybe less sawdust because that's a lot of carbon. And what if you can have some hay, 25% hay, 25% straw. Once again, I'm kind of staying in that 50 range of hay or straw because that really allows it to breathe. Could you be on the 40% side? Potentially, but 40% and say 60% of super dense manure, it's probably going to be too much. Now, we can always get into manures with bedding. Kind of changes the game, of course, because there's carbon in there, or the other thing is that, yeah, it could be soaked in, with urine, which can be high in nitrogen too, but bedding changes the game. So some of these areas you can see that people have tons of straw down or corn stalks, and that stuff it might have a lot more structure than just say straight cow manure. So the third recipe would be like 25% hay, 25% straw, 35% cow and horse manure, and then 15% sawdust. And so you can see wood chips can be breathable. So that could be part of this recipe and could go on your side that, they will let a pile breathe. Now, wood chips can be really high in carbon, or if they're green, they could be a little hot too. But the other thing to remember about wood chips is that the smaller the material, the more available it is for the biology to go after it. So the carbon in wood chips isn't exactly all available, is what I would like to call it. It's there, but it's not available. So when you're doing a recipe, when you gotta look at something that's 1 inch versus, like sawdust is very tiny and super available in its carbon.
What about the age of the manure? What if you have, I have years old horse manure.
It could be a little bit different than new. Like I said, this chicken manure, I would say it probably only lost, whatever scale it's on, it probably only lost 5%, 10% of its carbon, its nitrogen value. So if fresh horse manure is at 25:1, maybe it's 35:1 now. But it's most likely there. The big reason is because of our super dry climate. Did your horse manure get leached out? Most likely not. Like, I mean, if it is on the East Coast and it got a whole bunch of rain and it leached out and went wherever it goes, it might be even less or something. Also, and to put something a little more in perspective, if it actually has moist, it might have already composted. You know, you ever get into a pile of manure and it's hot? That's because it actually had some moisture content, and that can change its carbon to nitrogen ratio too. But so back to the old horse manure, it would most likely be still a good nitrogen source. It's not going to be like 70:1 or something. So I would count it as a nitrogen source.
So are you basically saying that you don't bother with putting your vegetable scraps in?
No.
I'm sitting there looking at this silver, this little chrome thing, it's like all the vegetables in it, I'm really meticulous about it.
Once again, you get into like compost tea. What are you really doing? What like we call it a compost bucket. Do you throw it more in your decomposing pile, or is it the problem that I see? So once again, yes, you're doing something with it and you're composting something. my point is like I'm gonna go make a pile and let that thing go through the whole cycle, right? So you need a big mass of that material, big mass of kitchen. But that's not what comes out of our kitchen. It comes out in a bucket a week. So how do you get this mass with preserving what's coming out of your kitchen? So once again, I'm sure a lot of people take their compost buckets, dump it into a bin, and you're doing a slow, passive if it's really not pulling temperature, what would be the definition of compost? Does it have to have temperature? And I wouldn't say, that's what I'm saying, it's kind of more of a passive decomposing, and it could be, and I like it, it really gets into worms. I really suggest it with the worms.
I love worms.
Yeah, and a worm bin would be great. Or if you have that pile and it's doing something and worms are getting into it and they're finding their sweet spot, then you're doing something great. If worms are in it and they're doing something, they're doing something great in that material. But one suggestion I would say is maybe do that pile. Say my goal is, okay, I'm going to collect for 3 or 4 months and whatever's there. Now I'm going to add some hay, now I'm going to add some manure, and leave that thing alone and start the next kitchen scrap pile. But add some material to it at some point and say, hey, I'm going to just let this do its thing all the way and move on to another pile. Might be a good suggestion.
I thought at times of just basically taking my scraps and I actually do this, I throw them in a blender with some water and I use that as my liquid for my compost.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm kind of already disintegrating it.
Yeah, and that will speed up the whole process. Yeah, I mean, that's what I was talking about. The size of the material allows the bacteria and the actual composting process to attack everything and activate it a lot faster. So, and at any moment, somebody's going to bust through the door and be like, you can make great compost with your small amount of stuff in the bag. It's just not what I do, and I don't see it from that point of view. So then that's once again like, not saying this is right or this is wrong. And we gotta lose faith. Yeah.
I was just gonna ask if you can touch upon if you were using bedding, like that has chicken and goat manure and urine in it, how that would alter, you said that would affect kind of the nitrogen content of the
Well, what was the first first part of that?
Oh, if I was using bedding for the compost, how that,
Yeah, well, and that's the point, like, if it was and we gotta look at, if it's a whole bunch of straw that didn't actually get the manure or urine soaked into it, then that's carbon. But if it's been sitting there being soaked with urine and manure, then it's probably already high and soaked, I wouldn't, yeah. I use a whole bunch of material where they use wood chips as the bedding for chickens. And I took my sample, sent it to the lab, and they're supposed to be grinding up all those wood chips with the manure and then testing it. That's what they're supposed to be doing. And it's 15-1 still. Where if the wood chips were by themselves, they might be 300-1. And the chicken manure would be 10-1. But now they mixed all of it together, and now it's 15. And that's how they're supposed to. I wonder if they did that. They're supposed to. Do you understand what I'm saying? Yeah. So it depends. You like I said, you see some people and they got a big pile of straw that the animals really didn't mess with. Then that's probably still high in carbon. But if it's shoved into the manure, like some places, and it's soaked and been soaking for 4 months. It's probably high in, but it could add structure because, everything's a little different. Compacted cow manure is different than compacted cow manure with straw. It's going to be a little fluffier. Like that's why horse manure, you ever see horse manure and it's like almost always fluffy, like once it dries out it's fluffy because they're really just eating hay and it's going right out. They don't have the 4 stomachs of the cows where you can't recognize anything after a cow eats it versus a cat. Horse, you're like, yeah, that's hay, probably. So, a lot of places have horse manure and sawdust bedding, and I've tested lots of that, and so once again, there can be a good amount of sawdust. I mostly only see sawdust, but it was in their bedding or it was in their stalls. They've been peeing on it. And it's 45-1. Where once again, is that sawdust usually 100-1, 200-1? But them actually being on top of it for that long, the nitrogen is soaked into the stuff. Yeah.
I wanted to ask what the best way to measure the temperature is.
They have compost thermometers that are 4 feet tall. And that gets into, at some point I meant to jump in there. So they say ideally you want to start with like some might say a 3 feet by 3 feet by 3 feet area. I still think that's kind of small amount, the starting material. But the reason why the compost thermometer is 4 feet is because you really need a 5 foot by 5 foot by 5 foot pile. And that's why it's 4 feet. But they have a digital analog. There's nice digital probe ones that are probably only $100, $200, and then maybe the metal or the 4 foot just analog one. It's probably way easily under $100. And I think Earth Family Supplies has them over towards Peonia, but online, of course. But yeah, and you could get creative. If you have some kind of other thermometer that might be long enough. But yeah. So once again, just to emphasize, from a point of, hey, I want to make a big pile. Well, the other idea I like too is you could have, say, make 3 separate piles. They're all a certain size that you're manageable, that are manageable for you. And as they break down, they're like my compost in 2 weeks has almost shrunk by 50%. So I can start with a big pile, and it'll be only half this size in 2 weeks. So one idea is to start 3 or 4 piles, have them big as you can manage. And then as they break down, you can add them to each other and make it bigger. Because once again, it's depending on how you really want to approach it. But that will, the reason why they want a pile so big is so it does buffer, like your core of your compost is buffered by the outside temperatures. And drying out in wind, storm, like we're gonna get 4 days of wind, how's that gonna dry out your compost? It's gonna allow your compost to breathe really well, but it's also gonna dry it out, and you're gonna have to add a lot of moisture. So size can be a buffer, yeah.
Should it be covered?
With a breathable fabric, potentially. So we have used, they're this woven fabric that are breathable. The main reason I would use them around here is maybe slow down the drying out effect of wind. Now, the big reason why they use tons of them in the east, and why I ended up buying a whole bunch and then I stopped using them, is because the main reason that they are around is for shedding water. And for the east where it rains a whole bunch, it'll rain for a week and make your compost horrible. So they shed the water. We don't have that problem. You probably pull off your compost cover when it rains and say, thank you, water my compost pile, and it probably won't do anything. But so I am able to keep my compost piles moist as I like them. So and it was a really big, imagine a 400-foot long row with a piece of fabric over it. And then here comes the wind. So I had all these heavy concrete blocks that will weigh it all down. So that's the main reason why I would cover it is, yeah, and I don't know if anybody's read about this or that on them, but that's the main, there's breathable. And it's funny because in the last class I said I have a whole bunch for sale if anybody wants to buy fabric. I got like probably 2,000 feet of some compost covers. And I compost with a guy that was composting, and he bought the covers at the beginning, and they're all laying in a big pile, rotting away. So, but that's because they're paid to do it, and if you're able to put enough moisture on them, they're not really needed. But yeah, they can slow down the wind. Once again, into that structural and what size of pile, and this is once again from a standpoint of I'm going to try to make a big pile of compost for myself or for next year. Start out with 3 or 4 smaller ones. They need to be a big enough pile. And that's the idea of having smaller ones, is that you could actually start with a smaller one, but as soon as it gets smaller, throw it into the other pile next to it, and then you'll have some mass again, and that's a good time to aerate it and to make sure it's moist enough and everything. And then you can add again. Their generalization is that compost shrinks by 50%. If you add enough water and there's not clay in the manure, my stuff will shrink by 30 or 40% easily. And that's actually been a hard game for me because I'm like saying, oh, this material costs this amount, and then it shrinks by 50% is different than it's shrinking by 75%. And I'm like, oh, great, there goes all my margin. It's shrunk. But I've learned that the more moisture content, it'll shrink by way more than 50%. If your manure has clay in it and stuff, it won't shrink as much. Wood chips obviously don't shrink as much, especially in, yeah, they stay put. So, she doesn't have another line, so let's see what's on this list. And also, just a little bit, depending on how, our compost is super, super nutrient dense because we really took it to its fullest limits of composting. If you go and buy compost at the Grand Junction facility and they're Race of Magic, it's going to be a different product because they really don't get it that moist. And they might stop composting halfway through, they might be like, hey, this is finished. So it's not broken down as much, and so in a form, it's not nutrient as dense as mine is because I've let it go through it and shrunk and shrunk and shrunk and shrunk. That goes the same with your compost potentially. You might use stuff in a little bit of a different way, depending on how fully composted you did it. and I can't really guide you on what you should do and where your compost is. Or in that sense, because it's a little up in the air where it's at and what it's gonna do and stuff. Like my stuff, I know there's people that use it really heavily, but on the other flip side, we recommend not to because it is really super nutrient dense and a little bit goes a long way. Where if it's not fully composted, it might not be as nutrient dense, and you might be able to use it at twice the rate as what I would recommend on mine. One other, I'm gonna probably bounce around a little bit here, just things I think are important. You could have, say you make a pile and it has 60% cow manure and the rest 60 or 70% cow manure, meaning that it has tons of nitrogen in there. But hey, it's only getting up to 120 degrees, 130 degrees. Oxygen really does make things hotter because it allows it to do its thing more. So you could have something that's really high on the 30-to-1 carbon to nitrogen ratio, but it's not getting hot. It's because it's not breathing enough. I've done lots of different things and a lot of not good things. And corrected them after some point. But I had the piles that, I was like, oh, they're only 120, 130 degrees. They should easily be 170, 160 degrees. And the main reason was because I had it too dense and it wasn't breathing and it didn't allow the temperatures to get very hot. So that's one, just looking at your pile. Some say moisture, how wet your compost piles. I look at it two different ways. The moisture can make your compost hotter, which is a counterintuitive thing, but I think it's also what it's doing is that it's actually allowing everything to be more available. The more moist it is, the more everything is activated, and then it can get hotter that way. But there's also there is something too that moisture at some point can also help bring down temperatures too, because things really dry can be really hot too. Like if you have a compost pile that's only at 35% water content, it could be at 170 no problem. It's just you have less material that's actually breaking down because it's so dry. So in that situation, you could easily add more moisture. But at the same time, I do think a little bit that the more moisture you have activates stuff. So to some degree, I think there's how long a compost pile can be hot too. I'm kind of trying to keep up with my own thoughts. The whole goal is for your compost, if you're making the right recipe and everything, is for it to go up, peak in 2 to 3 weeks, and then start gradually coming down. It could peak and go plateau for 2 months. It could be at 160 degrees for 2 months. And there could be a few reasons. You didn't add enough water in the beginning, and then you added more water, and that helped release more of the nutrients to get hot. Or there's just too much nitrogen. And the nitrogen is going on and on and on and keeping it hot. So that's all a little bit of a practice and stuff, and that's where I would really document with what you're doing with your ingredients to maybe make adjustments for the next year, or make a couple sets of piles in the same year and see what you did different. And then I think it's a really good idea to maybe do a 5-minute of water or 10 minutes of water a day and see where that's at and be like, hey, I need to do only 8 minutes or something because it seems too moist and stuff. One really big recommendation I have is to, when you're building your pile, don't build your pile and then try to get it wet. Try to get, maybe potentially, like if you have a wheelbarrow or something, get your drier material up to that percentage, then put it in the pile, And then, and potentially don't try to get all of your, do it step by step on your materials before you mix them. And try to get them up to what you think is 50 or 60% moisture content. How do you tell that? If you can take material, like I wouldn't be, if I could squeeze water out of hay, I would not be worried about it. But if you're squeezing water out of manure, it's too moist. And it's one of those things, it's the same as like baking a cake. Some people, it's just, you know how to do it now. And it's hard to explain, but if you can make like a hard ball with your material and kind of like just drop it and it's not breaking apart, that's too moist. Or if you make a ball and it just kind of breaks apart in your hand, you want it to be able to squeeze the material and it holds its form but also breaks apart if you drop it. That's a good starting point. And like I said, generally you can easily have things probably more moist than you think. That is definitely, I've only probably made piles too wet, you know, way less than too dry. Most of my compost has been too dry for quite a few years, or it ends up taking me longer because somewhere it's moist enough, but then later on it gets more and more moist and breaks down slowly that way. Excuse me. There's a couple other. Yeah, so soaking material in a wheelbarrow I think would be good to start out with. And if you are baling the pile on the ground and you are going to plan on trying to keep it moist as possible, have a little bit of a slope to it, and don't put it in maybe a dip or a bowl or something. Don't build your piles in that, because that bottom is going to, all the moisture is going to run to that center. So a 3% slope or a tiny little slope is good. So you could soak that pile and the excess water drain out. It would be important. The same as I'm kind of suggesting, maybe doing the pallets, that allows for the same thing. So if you do have a big flat area and you have you have 6 pallets and you can put your pile on there, it's going to allow it to breathe in the bottom. And also you can soak that pile and let the moisture run out the bottom. A little bit of clay can help too. They recommend up to like 10% clay, and that can do a few things. It can hold in moisture content, and also there's this old composting method from Eastern Europe that they actually say that like when you add clay, it allows something. There's like negative ions and positive ions, and the compost actually locks onto the clay and is actually making humus, which is somewhat soil. So there is a recommendation to add some clay to your compost. It also can bind up some odors too. It's supposed to be a certain amount of clay too, so we have a lot of loam around here, so there is a lot of clay. They have a soil test. Essentially put your material in a jar, you shake it up, and you can see your different layers of, it's probably online. You want to test what you have and not just adding whatever, but rock dust can be a really good thing too. Basalt rock dust or the bacteria really like that, and it can also lock in some odors. And it's usually has a lot of good micronutrients. Some kind of rock dust, or there's those products like Gaia Green or Azomite you can add. And that's at a very small ratio, probably just like 1% or something, where the clay can be 10. And then the other thing is the size of your materials, once again. If you're able to do anything about it, it might help, because even broken down hay, you don't need hay that's like this to keep structure. You just need hay, your hay is going to not ever be at 90% moisture content in your pile. I mean, can you even get hay up to 30 or 40% because it's just the structure of it and stuff. So if you're able to grind, like if you have a bale grinder or your neighbor's got a bale grinder and you want to do a pile and you can grind some of that down, that's gonna help, make compost faster and better and quicker. So material size is really important. It can help. We all know, yeah.
Well, I was just gonna, sorry to interrupt.
No.
So if you have the optimal nitrogen percentage in your pile, ideally about how long are you gonna keep it at that peak temp, so that you can kill the pathogenic material, but also foster environment for beneficials before it starts coming down in temp?
I think the recommendation, once again, and this is, you gotta take into account turning that material in. And that's why is all that stuff actually gonna, so wherever that temperature is, right there at 130 degrees, that material might be weed-free and pathogen-free in 3 days, right there. But so from there, the recommendation is 2 to 3 weeks at those temperatures, because the idea is you constantly turning in all that material, hitting that temperature. So it depends on where, I haven't seen all the scientific literature, but it depends on how well you feel that all that material is getting to that temperature. So that's why they could be they actually have a little bit different recommendations for the type of composting you're doing, where it might take me only 2 weeks because of the way I'm doing it. It might take you a month. I will honestly say, in your backyard, in your compost is probably going to peak. That's why maybe I don't have a straight answer for you. Is because my compost easily goes up to 160 degrees and it's there for a month and a half. I've never had any issues with weed seeds. Knapweed, you name it, I've never had an issue. But your backyard compost is more likely to go up and come back down quicker, just because of the size of the pile and things. And so if you're really concerned about those things, size matters, and turning it and getting all the material in there. But they recommend 2 to 3 weeks at those temperatures.
Okay. Good to know. Ours gets really hot, and so I just wanted to know how long, how long is too long, I guess. So.
Too long, I know, that's where they might have a whole bunch of information on the internet, and I'm like, my pile stays at 160 for 2 months sometimes. But I'm aerating it, and the good thing is if it doesn't go funky and really bad in that period, you're gonna make great compost at the end. So is there a golden number to be at 2 or 3 or 4 weeks versus 2 months where I end up sometimes? Yeah. Beware of herbicides. That's the other big one. A lot of herbicides do not get broken down with your compost, and especially backyard potentially because, some herbicides are persistent, meaning they're supposed to hang out for a couple years, and no. Does 160 degrees take care of herbicides? No. Does time take care of herbicides? I'm sure, who knows? They tested some hay that was up in a barn for 10 years and the herbicides are still there. I mean, does air take care of it? Sun does break down some herbicides. Oxygen you would assume, but there are some that are more persistent than others. It does depend on what herbicide we're talking about. And do your tomatoes, beans, broadleaf plants like herbicides? No. So that try to be conscious. It's really hard to find material that doesn't have herbicides. And it's hard for me and hard for everybody. That's why they got into all these like straw bale gardens and stuff like that. And then some years back, they were like, oh, maybe that's actually not a good idea because all our weed-free straw bales that have herbicides on them. So that's something to be conscious about. If you make great compost and then it kills your tomatoes, might have been herbicides. And then another little thing about picking out ingredients is sodium. We really try to stay away from, most of the time we're only at 50% manures. If we are using manures, we're actually usually a lot less using manures. So obviously manures can have a lot of sodium, which it'll just get concentrated down into your compost. And so you could have high sodium compost if you're, doing a lot of manure. So that's another reason why to be, biodiverse in your ingredients. And try not to overdo the manure. That's usually the cheapest and most available thing around sometimes. Something that I really, really recommend is there's Dr. Johnson. He's a professor down in New Mexico, and he's been doing. He has him and his wife. It's called the Sue/Johnson bioreactor composting. You might find it under Johnson/Sue bioreactor. And it's a compost pile that is on one pallet, and you build it a certain way, and it's potentially a super high fungal compost. To back up a little bit, a lot of our compost is, or a lot of our soil, a lot of our compost is really high in bacterial content. They're finding that more and more, of course, the fungal communities are extremely important, but it's actually like in my composting method, it's really hard to have fungal communities because fungal communities don't like to be whacked around. It takes things to be stable in a that's where potentially a static pile, that's another name for a passive pile, where you're not turning a whole bunch. You have the ability to potentially have high fungal compost in that situation, which is extremely important. And a lot of our soils need fungal communities. So, and in these systems, and like his, it takes a year long, and they find bacteria from Antarctica. They find things like bacterial and fungal hyphae from all around the world because that's the air, our air goes around and brings it all into the pile. They hang out there if you get the conditions just right. They hang out and proliferate in your pile. And I would there's really good videos, and I would really look that up for a backyard thing. He makes his material. It's on a pallet. It's got a wire around it, and then he uses that like weed cloth barrier to hold the materials in. The other thing with fungal communities is they really want to be within, and this is why another reason it's hard for us to do it is they want to be within 1 foot of fresh oxygen. So you're asking about pipes and how. So they find that within 1 feet away from fresh air, the fungal hyphae stop doing their thing and stop proliferating. So in his system, he has this, then he does pipes down through it, and then after it sits for a week, you're able to pull the pipes out because the soil or the compost actually holds form, and that lets that thing just breathe. But he also has to, he has a little mister on it. Every day it gets misted because it has to be at the right moisture content for everything to say, hey, I want to hang out here. And then once the temperatures go up and the temperatures come back down to closer to 100 degrees somewhere and potentially 70 degrees somewhere, he introduces worms. And then the worms do their thing. And this stuff is like super high potent. And what it's so potent that he's actually able to do a extract of it. And essentially, once again, back to the compost tea thing, he makes an extraction, and he's able to do 10 acres with a pallet like this or something. There's some kind of ratio. So I really look at that for your backyard.
Where do you get worms? Can I
Order
get
them
the-
online.
Can I get the bait worms at the creek market?
It's red wigglers. You have to look online. It is certain worms. Not all worms do the same thing.
Okay. and
I think it is some of your. I've killed tons of worms. Trying to do multiple of those things. Like I've tried to make big piles and throw them in there. They really love their environment, but online might be the easiest. There's definitely tons of, and there's two. There's the red. I think the red wiggler, and I think it's the night crawler that does do some, but mostly the red wiggler is the worm that loves to break down material. So yeah. Any questions? Overload?
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Just wanted to tell Mike a huge thank you. That was like a lot of great information, so thank you. You'll have to come back and talk about compost tea. 'Cause
Yeah.
that's like, yeah, I'd be really, I know I'd be really interested.
Yeah,
so.
it's a great way. I mean, compost tea. I mean, I've done it with like pine soil plants, and it's just the root mass and the stock mass just is pretty amazing.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, on that note, just want to say, if this all was too much, you just want to buy his compost instead, you can go to his website, Soil Not Dirt, contact him. Soilnotdirtfarm.com, or does Earth Friendly still have?
Yes.
Or
yeah.
Earth Friendly Supply, just west of Paonia has it. If you have a truck, you can go over there, you can buy it by the yard, and it's really easy, so it's another place to get it. It's amazing stuff. We have used it at our farm a lot. So thank you. And just wanted to mention that next month, we'll be meeting here again. May 14th is the second Saturday of the month, so what's it? So over a month away from now. But it's going to be creating your own salsa garden, which Kathleen has coordinated organized with me. Yeah, and so we'll be meeting, hopefully it'll be a beautiful day, we're gonna be meeting in the courtyard that day. But yeah, just watch for email updates, and we'd love to see you again. Thanks for coming today.
Thank you guys. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yep.